Hush now. Let your breath find its slow rhythm, like the steady beat of a distant engine. Inhale the cool, thin air of midnight between the stars. Exhale, and feel the small warmth of your body press gently against the dark. Listen. There is a sound that never quite goes away in the vastness. The faint, patient hum of industry. It is the galaxy's lullaby, a low, mechanical purr that wraps around whole worlds and keeps them breathing. Imagine, if you will, a single point of light among so many. It is not the brightest. It is small and blue and insists on being ordinary. Around it turn the slow gears of civilizations. Spinning mills, ancient forges, cathedrals of iron where men and women fold their prayerful hands beneath vaulted ceilings of rust. The light enters this world like a benediction, touching the ridged armor of a distant planetary manufactorum, the cracked wooden hymnals in a backwater parish, the glassy face of a child who studies the constellations and dreams of ships. The Imperium is not a shout. It is a measured chant, a ritual performed by countless hands across uncounted nights. It is the whisper of a mother crossing herself beneath the halo of a flickering lamp. It is the cadence of a factory foreman's orders over the muted din of production lines. It is the soft, disciplined breathing of a watchman who stares at a horizon where suns are small and patience is long. There is a tenderness to order when you listen closely. The great engines throttle and then settle like a carriage easing into a lane. Servo arms lower like careful hands. The lights inside hablocks glow with the grandmotherly warmth of domestic fires. Even in its scale and severity, there is a kind of ancient grace to the machinery that keeps the Imperium alive. Pipes sing in the walls, pumps whisper. The great data vaults, those tombs of memory and lore, exhale the smallest of sighs as their redheads trace patterns long recorded. These are not violent sounds. They are the sounds of things continuing, quietly insisting on tomorrow. Hear also the vox. It is a steady, comforting presence, distant transmissions woven together, a tapestry of messages that encourage continuity. A sermon is delivered on one frequency, a child's laughter bubbles on another, a lover's promise, soft as a feather, drifts through yet another. The vox carries the small human things that make worlds feel inhabited. Names, recipes, a minor complaint about the weather, the exchange of trivial news that, when strung together, becomes an atlas of hope. The Imperium's voxnet is as much a lullaby as its engines, and prayer, always prayer. In the hush before sleep, you can almost hear it, the half-remembered phrases sung by the devout who keep the faith in the dim hours. The words are often the same, short, repeated, a rhythm that steadies like a metronome. They are offered to distant saints, to the emperor whose face is a lantern in the darkness, to the machine god in the colliginous shrines of the tech adepts. The prayers are small candles held against a long night. They do not ask for grandeur. They ask for the quiet miracle of continuity. Food for the famished, warmth for the cold, the safe return of ships. In the spaces between the great things, the small things persist. A market that never fully empties. An old woman sitting by a window mending a garment in the glow of a single bulb. The slow, patient work of librarians who catalogue the last copies of books because someone, somewhere, still reads. It is these human strains, the lullabies taught to infants, the tiny, stubborn defiance of finishing one more cup of tea, that make the vast machine bearable. There is a humanity here that clings to routine and finds comfort in repetition. Now hold that image, the machine's hum, the warm lights of habitation, prayers repeated like a safety net. Let it settle. This is the world the story begins in, not with a thunderclap, but with the steady insistence of life continuing. That is the first thing to remember. When you hear tales of darkness, they often start here, in the ordinary and the well-ordered. There is a cultivated calm to the galaxy's edges. Far-out colonies keep their lamps low at night. Watchmen stand on platforms and run their gloved fingers across the railings, feeling the cool bite of metal and the resonance of engines beneath their boots. In the manufactorums, men who have worked the same bolts for decades hum the same tune. Their hands remember the motion, even when their minds wander. The sky on many worlds opens like a patient mouth, giving long pastoral views of stars sliding in slow procession. To a child on a Hive World rooftop, these stars are a blanket, infinite and familiar, but even blankets fray. Even the most careful systems bear a seam that will one day unwind. Whispers begin softly. In a small port, somewhere at the edge of known shipping lanes, a captain notices a gap in the manifests. A freighter's name that used to appear each month has not come in for 2. He shrugs and blames bad weather. The galaxy has storms that last for years. In a mining settlement, a foreman finds an empty drill hold where a worker's locker should be. He chalks it up to old age and people who leave and never say goodbye. A Vox message drops out for a moment, not with a crack, but as if someone pinched the line's breath for a second. Nothing notable, just a hiccup in the transmission, a minor inconvenience. These little inconsistencies are not headlines. They fold into the background, the same way a missing stitch is unnoticed in a frayed cloak until the seam begins to widen. People continue to patch, to pray, to count the days. After all, the hum remains. Pumps still thrum. The priests still chant. Life persists, and yet the galaxy remembers in ways that do not always make sense. The memories are not always polite. They come in slivers, as if from a dream that refuses to be dismissed. A miner will tell of a lantern that glowed at the bottom of a shaft where lamps are forbidden. A child will say they saw a shadow move under the cantilever that should not have been there. A midshipman will wake and insist he heard a voice speaking in a tongue half remembered from a history lesson. These incidents are small, and they are often laughed off. A superstition, a fatigue-born fancy. But these things climb like lichen. They are patient. They find purchase in cracks where light is thin. You will meet many who speak of certainty. Engineers who quote tables, priests who recite doctrine, and they are steadier than most. Yet even they sometimes lower their eyes when asked about the outer colonies. They say, in the quiet that follows a long silence, that the fringe has always had shadows. It has always harbored things that don't keep the same clocks as we do. On some worlds, the nights are long and the storms have teeth. On others, the light itself seems to thin, as if the sun worries and grows tired. Listen now to the stories told by the older sailors, the ones who have crossed between systems often enough that their hair has silvered. They prefer solitude, and they speak in the kind of voice a man uses when he does not wish to alarm. We lost a ship once, one will say, and not to pirates or to war. It simply did not answer. No distress call, no wreckage, no record beyond a single transmission that garbled like a mouth underwater. The signal smelled of iron and something else, salt, perhaps, or blood, the way voices smell when they come from the deep. He will stare at his hands and not talk more. The next man on deck will tap the side of his helmet and say the warp is capricious on certain lanes. Consensus forms. Sometimes the void takes what it wants. Those are the kinds of stories that do not fit neatly into doctrine. The Adeptus Mechanicus has charts and logs, and the Inquisition keeps what it keeps. And there are men who look into the warp and measure its moods. They will tell you that the galaxy is mostly a ledger balanced of necessity and faith. But even their ledgers have blanks. On an Imperial register, a missing freighter is a number. In a mother's diary, it is a name. Numbers can be reconciled. Names cannot be put so easily back in place. The first cracks are polite. They do not roar. They breathe. They close and they open. A colony governor will look at census figures and notice anomalies. Births reported at unusual hours. Increases in stillness on duty rosters. A slow, inexplicable rise in the number of congregants at a certain shrine. A confessing brother in a parish may note that the same phrase has been whispered in several different mouths across several neighborhoods, and he will mark it with a small cross before he crosses himself and continues his round. There is a peculiar kind of whisper that sometimes comes through the vox beyond static, a tone that does not belong to any known language, a harmony that sits for a second under the voice of an announcer. It tugs gently at the edge of memory, like the ghost of a lullaby hummed in another life. Old women who have spent their whole lives counting stitches and knitting prayers sometimes pause mid-work and fold their hands as if recalling something that was theirs a long time ago. They do not speak of what they remember. They simply pause, breathe, and return to their knitting. If you listen with the patience of a watchman, you will hear these patterns. The hush of normalcy is interrupted by small, almost polite interruptions. It is as if something is learning the rhythm of the galaxy and, for a time, is content to move in time with it. Match the beat of a drum and you can walk into a tent without making it look odd. But there is another sound, less common, that occasionally threads its way into the night. It is a soft, persistent tapping, like a finger counting on the inside of a skull. It can be a child calling in their sleep. It can be the tremor of a collapsed tunnel. And sometimes, in the rarest, most private accounts, it is a voice that speaks an unacceptable intimacy. We are with you, some will whisper in the dark, and afterward, they will smile like people who have just been told a joke they were not meant to understand. They keep that smile to themselves. Do not be alarmed by these beginnings. They are not yet threats. They are the slowest kind of change, the kind that unspools a knot rather than breaking it outright. They are the first notes in a song that will not end the way you might expect. So rest, if you wish. Close your eyes and imagine the mechanical lullaby again. The hum, the vox, the whispered prayers, like a thin shawl over sleeping shoulders. Let it soothe. Let the glow of 1,000 lights sketch safe shapes across your mind, for in the calm there is safety, for now. The galaxy is vast, and the Imperium is patient, and yet the night holds its own counsel, and in the quiet you can almost sense that the stars themselves lean forward, listening for an answer they will not yet find. There will be more to tell, and the story will tilt in ways that make the night grow colder. But for this moment the edges are soft. The machines breathe. The people of the Imperium murmur their rites and wait for dawn. And if, in that waiting, you hear a small sound that does not belong, the tremor of a voice beneath a hymn, a shadow that should not be, a name that repeats like a secret, do not startle. It is only the beginning. Begin as you did before, by letting your breathing match the slow rhythm of the world. Imagine a town carved into the side of a crater, or a cluster of hab blocks clinging like barnacles to the flank of an industrial planet. Picture a network of tunnels that have been widened by generations of pickaxes and drills. The walls marked by the circular scars of boring tools and the faded graffiti of those who passed through before. There are carts that run on rails slick with oil, and ladders that climb up to light wells where the pale sun slips through dust to touch the faces of the living. These are not great halls of state or marble temples. They are workaday places, the belly of a world that keeps others fed, the underbelly whose labor makes the Imperium turn. The people who live here keep the hours of machines. They rise before the suns and sleep after them. They know the smell of coolant and the weight of coal under their nails. They fold their lives into shift patterns and meal tokens, learning to be content within the geometry of their days. There is a small, steady dignity to this. Watch a miner as he straps on his lamp and trusts it to the dark. See a loader's hands, the skin rubbed raw by rope and chain. Notice the way a woman in a factory tilts her head to listen to a line hum and, with a practiced hand, corrects the rhythm of the machine. These are intimate things. They are the bones of the settlement's life. The morning distribution of water, the whispered gossip at the mess, the way an old man sits on a crate to watch the steam rise from the kettles. It is a gentle, ordinary choreography. In the beginning, the cult is not obvious. It grows like a root under a paving stone, unseen, patient, intimate. It starts in kitchens and sleeping bunks, in lanes where children play marbles and the older boys smoke on street corners. It begins with gestures so small you might mistake them for habit. A miner who always wipes his hands on the same patch of cloth. A mother who tucks her child in with a particular whisper that is not quite a name. A foreman who insists his team pray the same short prayer before each shift, not out of piety, but because the rhythm steadies tired hands. Observe the faces of these folk in the low light. Most wear the blunt, honest expressions of people who measure life by output and rations. But there are variations. A flash of humor in one face, a narrowed look of suspicion on another, and sometimes a gaze that lingers a little too long on the shape of a child's brow, or a hand that lingers on another's shoulder in an odd, careful way. You would excuse these touches, and most people do. They are human gestures given context by poverty and proximity, yet the eyes sometimes carry a softness that takes a fraction too long to fade, a softness that has the quality of secret recognition. Routine is a kind of religion here, and the cult learns to dress itself in routine's clothes. A weekly gathering becomes a maintenance briefing, a festival becomes a harvest count. They use what is necessary, an offhand blessing before a descent into the shafts, a song hummed beneath the din of conveyors. Their language is mostly the language of work and necessity. They speak of quotas, of corrupted parts, of the weather systems overhead. They speak sometimes in the same cadences as everyone else. It is that very normalcy that helps the cult hide. If you listen to the early prayers, the ones that precede machining hours or the lowering of a lift, you will hear them as plain and unremarkable. They begin as petitions to known saints, to the emperor, to patrons who have long guarded a given trade. Yet, over time, there are small inflections. A name is substituted, a phrase is repeated a beat longer. The changes are gentle, deliberate, like a potter smoothing the rim of a cup until no rough edge remains. An outsider would likely notice nothing. A practiced ear, familiar with the old rites, will find that some lines now linger on a consonant that was never pronounced before. Rituals appear where there is darkness enough to conceal them. In the deeper galleries, where water drips from ceilings and the sound swells into a chorus, men and women gather in the hours when the machines grind low. Torches are set in iron sconces, their light making brief, trembling islands against the wet rock. The flames throw long, soft shadows that climb the walls like quiet things. The air smells of steam and smoke and old oil. It is easy to mistake these gatherings for union meetings or prayers for the dead. They have similar elements. There are speeches, lists of grievances, a reading of names. There is, too, an intimacy that does not belong to a bureaucratic meeting. Hands are held in a way that suggests more than comfort. Voices share cadences that weave together until they sound like an instrument tuned to one key. Listen to a chant in one of these underground rooms. The tones begin low and unobtrusive, a syllable repeated until it becomes an almost physical presence. At first it feels like a counting out game, something that measures time while hands busy themselves with rope or bread. The words are simple. They might speak of harvest or of bounty, but beneath the surface, there is an insistence, the repetition of a particular suffix, a clap between lines, a hush at the end, where everyone inhales together. These are not elaborate liturgies. They are small, private incantations, and their power is in their subtlety. Children learn the cult's language through play. A child's game becomes the scaffolding for a later ritual. Simple rhymes hold hidden patterns. Nursery rhymes are adapted into hymns that no outsider would recognize. A game of stones becomes an offering. A lullaby becomes a mnemonic for names and sequences. The cult is keen to harvest the pliability of youth. It is in the small hands, the believing eyes, that the cult finds the first truest seed of its continuing hold. There are physical signs too, small at first, then more pronounced. A callus here on a thumb where a worker grips a rod, nothing to remark on. But sometimes the callus aligns oddly, forming a crescent or a fold that seems to mimic a claw. A miner returns from a shift with a nick on his hand that healed wrong, the scar pulling the skin into a suspicious angle. Mothers bring babes to the temple and show additional bones in their wrists, nothing medical men can readily explain. Clerks in the registry notice odd entries. A birth recorded with an extra digit noted in plain handwriting. A baptismal certificate that lists a middle syllable missing from the child's given name. These are small anomalies, and the bureaucracy is good at smoothing them away. They are called clerical errors or mistaken entries, but the pattern grows. The cult symbols are never crude. They do not paint themselves in the open. Instead, they are stitched into the hem of a working coat, or hammered as a tiny mark beneath the tongue of a boot. A foreman's rivet will have a tiny notch that, to the untrained eye, is simply the maker's mark. But to a certain eye, that notch is a sigil. The sigil is not ornate. It speaks in economy. It is a compact phrase intended to be read only by those who already know how to read it. And then there are the hands. The first time you notice them, it might be during a slow, ordinary afternoon at the foundry, when the heat makes everything blur and men sit with their faces wet and red from the furnaces. Someone wipes their brow and you see the fingers, long, slightly too flexible at the joints, a subtle knuckle that catches the light. Another hand, used to holding a wrench, seems to close with a silence that betrays fewer calluses than it should. The differences are small enough to excuse. A doctor would call them anomalies. An old woman in the market will examine a hand and smile with a secretive fondness. She will say, "The family has come a long way." No one asks what she means. The phrase itself is a language that the market understands. Some know, some pretend not to know. Belief is formed of stories. The Genestealer Cults tell themselves a story of chosenness. It is not a story proclaimed loudly on plazas. Rather, it is told bedside, whispered like the names of saints. "You are of the family," a mother tells a child as she smooths a brow. "We are chosen, blessed with a purpose." The language is tender. It wraps the listener in consolation. To be chosen is to be spared the randomness of fate. It is to belong to something greater than grinding quotas and empty rations. The chosen are given small privileges, extra bread when it arrives, a spare blanket, a nod that opens doors. These comforts are not ostentatious. They work precisely because they are enough to make the recipient believe. Think for an instant of the internal logic that makes the cult persuasive. Life under constant production, under the glare of rationing, and under the unending need to prove worth, is a pressure that seeks release. A narrative that says, you are special, you are picked, you are more than your daily ledger. This is a kind of mercy. It does not promise wealth. It promises meaning. It reinterprets suffering as a sign of favor. The crying child is not cursed but chosen. The scarred hand is not an injury but a mark. This revaluation of pain and loss is a salve for souls who have been taught to find their worth in service and production. Their theology borrows freely from the cultural landscape. It grabs phrases from imperial creed and rearranges them like mosaics. The emperor's name is sometimes invoked, not as blasphemy, but as a borrowed halo to give the cult's claims legitimacy. It is beaten into quiet hymns in the same meter as other rituals. To an outsider, the words ring right, but the accent is wrong, the emphasis shifted. The result is a religion that sounds familiar and therefore safe, while it quietly alters what the words mean. The leaders, the patriarchs and matriarchs, are not grand demagogues. They are often the quietest, the most ordinary of faces. Look for the one who moves among people without demanding attention. The one who knows every job roster and who can find a missing child in a crowd as if by instinct. They possess a particular sort of charisma, the ability to notice details others miss, to hold a family's secrets with a practiced warmth. They gain trust by being useful, finding work where there is none, smoothing a record, keeping a table free for a neighbor. Their power is practical and therefore unthreatening. It is the economy of small mercies, a saved ration, a saved seat, an explanation for a misfortune. The cult is patient beyond most things. It does not seek revolution in the square. It prefers the slow turn of culture. It cultivates loyalty like one tends a garden. Prune here, water there, harvest when ready. New members are not coerced so much as invited. An invitation arrives in the form of a favor repaid, an old debt cleared, a child accepted into a circle of playmates. Once the invitation is accepted, the convert is gradually exposed to the cult's deeper practices. Whispered vows, shared meals that exclude certain ingredients, a small rite of passage that involves a stone or a metal token pressed into a palm. And yet the cult carries its tragedies openly. The doctrine of chosenness is a kind of consolation and a kind of prison. For those within it, to be chosen is to be lifted out of anonymity, but also to be bound to an identity that will not tolerate doubt. The family claims its converts with tenderness and then with iron. A man who doubts is gently redirected. A woman who questions receives extra care and fewer responsibilities. Sometimes this care is suffocating. Children who are favored may be sheltered from the harshness of the work floor so completely that later, when they must take up tool and rope, their hands tremble. Others are asked to take risks in secret, to perform tasks that, if discovered, would brand them as traitors. You have been selected to carry the burden, they are told, and the burden is offered as an honor. Who would refuse an honor? Observe the stories told at the cult's more private gatherings, and you will see how tragedy is romanticized. Songs praise sacrifice, a hymn for the man who worked one shift too many and slipped into the machines, leaving his family a meal ticket and a place at the table. There is no bitterness in the tale. There is a certain approving hush, as if the accident was an act of devotion. The narrative closes the wound with meaning. Loss is a testament wrapped and presented as proof of belonging. The cult also teaches an economy of secrets. Names are doubled, histories folded in on themselves. An old man might speak of an ancestor who went away and never really explained the meaning. A woman who bears a child with an odd defect is told to keep it close, to swaddle and hush until the child's differences can be explained away as a quirk of heredity. Sometimes the cult sees indifference an omen and prepares for it. Other times it hides the sign until it can be shaped. This secrecy both protects the group and tightens its grip. The more strangers imagine something odd, the more the family must explain, and the more the family finds excuses to bring people inward. There is an art to recruitment, and the cult practices it as artisanship. The first stage of recruitment often involves making life easier in a mundane way, getting a worker a day off, ensuring his child receives a ration, moving a needed spare part from a locked storeroom to a grateful foreman. Each small kindness is priced, with an ask that is almost invisible. "We can help you," someone will say over a shared cup of tea. "We have a place for your sister in the evening shift." Come to our meeting and speak with others who were saved. The help comes wrapped in a story, a modest ritual, a welcome, an assignment to fold a cloth in a particular way. The favors are practical, binding, and they wear down the suspicion of the needy. And then there is loyalty, which the cult encourages like currency. Loyalty buys gratitude, gratitude buys silence. Those who have been helped owe something in return. What starts as the repayment of a favor becomes, over years, a pattern of mutual dependence. A man who owes the family a favor will be asked, quietly, to look the other way when a child sneaks into the gallery at night. Later, he may be asked to deliver a crate whose contents are not what they seem. Each ask is small. Each ask is a thread connecting him to a larger fabric. The cult's theology reveres lineage. It speaks in terms of families and bloodlines and long chains of belonging. It names what it wants to be permanent: the family, the seed, the chosen. This language recasts everyday kinship into something ceremonial. You will hear phrases like, "the line grows," or "the seed has taken." The use of agricultural metaphor is intentional. It comforts. A people who feed others with their labor will accept cultivation as a noble goal. To be cultivated is to be tended and made fruitful. The metaphor cloaks transformation in domestic language: pruning, grafting, harvest. The imagery of growth makes the soul accept change, because change is framed as natural. Yet there is a quiet horror at the edges of these images, if you look closely. The idea of being grafted onto a family has tender connotations and darker ones. In the cult's kitchen, someone will hum that soothing song about grafting branches, a line about healing, about joining, about sharing sap. Yet when the words are sung beneath torchlight, with the rhythm slowed and the eyes lowered, the same lyrics can feel like directions. The ease with which ordinary agrarian metaphors twist into instructions for altering bodies is where the true unease hides. Language softens the extraordinary until it becomes domestic again. Look at the younger members, those who have been raised within these softened rites. They move through the world with an ease that is born of certainty. They know rules that the old world never needed to teach. The correct way to fold a veil, the moment to avert your gaze, the particular cadence for answering a greeting. There is an intimacy among them that is at once beautiful and claustrophobic. They laugh easily, share small contraband luxuries, and sleep in a circle that keeps the cold at bay. But they are also trained to expect, to watch, and to report. A child once taught to count the rails will, as an adult, be a meticulous observer. The cult makes use of these trained instincts. If the cult's nature has a single tragic heart, it is this: it offers belonging at the cost of a person's private self. It transforms loneliness into identity, and identity into duty. For those inside, questions are dangerous because they risk unbinding the very thing that has made life bearable. A man who doubts may find himself suddenly adrift. He loses the warmth of a shared meal, the small favors that knit him into a network of mutual aid. He becomes, in effect, impoverished twice over, materially and socially. The cult leverages this iniquity with a kind of merciless logic. To be chosen is to be censured for doubting. The ways in which the cult prepares a person for deeper rites are often clinical and tender at once. Early initiations might ask for nothing more than a token placed upon a windowsill or a spoon left unwashed at the base of a stair. Things that seem insignificant until, months later, you understand they were tests of obedience. Later, more intimate rites will be performed with care. The careful binding of a wrist with a strip of cloth, the pressing of a cooled metal token into a child's palm as if to stop their restlessness, the careful scissors that remove, under whisper, a certain scrap of hair. These acts are not accompanied by there is compassion in the way the cult tends to its members. Illness is met with blankets and the attentive hands of neighbors. Widows are fed and children are given places at tables. In this care, the cult's savagery wears a gentle face. It is a paradox. Things that are loving in one register become instruments of control in another. The warmth of a blanket can be a binding cord. A saved ration can become the price of silence. This is the tragedy that lives at the core of the cult's appeal. It is a tender tyranny. As with any organism, the cult's survival depends on secrecy and assimilation. It thrives in places where the light is low and the work is meaningful. It prefers lives that are measured by the beat of industry because the rhythm of labor makes people predictable and therefore pliable. It grows from human need, rations, companionship, explanation, and then reinterprets those needs as signs of divine favor. The suffering that once made people desperate becomes, under the cult's logic, proof that they were chosen to endure. By the time the signs become undeniable to an attentive outsider, the cult has already braided itself into the daily life of 100 families. Its hymns are sung in the canteens, its notches appear on coins, its favors are recorded in ledgers. It is not easily excised. The authority that binds it together is not merely belief, but also the practical infrastructures it controls. The spare parts, the food caches, the shifts. Removing the cult would, in many cases, mean removing the very scaffolding that keeps people fed and warm. It is a kind of social parasite that, paradoxically, sustains its host. So listen again to the dripping in the deepest caverns where the cult meets. Hear the torches, the metal-gloved hands, the whisper of prayer that is comfortable now with its own peculiar inflections. Feel the warmth of the torchlight against cold rock and the hush that descends as voices fall into shared cadence. Recognize the tragedy beneath the tenderness, how belonging is purchased with a surrender of certain freedoms, how kindness can mask commandeering, how the promise of exception becomes a chain. In these places, people live by the stories they tell themselves about why they endure. They say the line grows, they say the seed is strong. They hold their children close and tell them they are chosen, and the children smile because being chosen feels good. The songs bind them, the hands shape them. The family keeps them. There is comfort in that binding. There is also a slow, inexorable fraying at the edges. Little oddities, small signs, accumulate like rust on iron. In the hush of their rites, a new grammar of belonging is taught. For those who learn it, the world gains meaning. For those who later realize they cannot unlearn it, the world narrows into a corridor where every door has been carefully placed by others. And so the cult goes on, patient and domestic, a net woven into the fabric of everyday life. You can walk among them and not see the threads. You can sleep beside them and not hear the whisper. But if you stay long enough, your hands will take on their rhythms. Your tongue will learn their cadences. Your laugh will fit into their circle. It is the most profound danger of all, an ease that becomes identity. Let your breath slow with that thought. In the lamplight and in the foundry steam, in the low hymn and in the secret notch, the cult breeds its future with soft hands. You may imagine it as a garden. You may imagine it as an embrace. Either way, the place it makes is both homely and strange. For now, the family's quiet. The lamplighters walk their rounds. Coal is fed into hoppers. Huddled figures hum as they mend. The rhythm is steady. The warmth is enough. Yet beneath the surface, in the drip of water and the murmur that follows a prayer, something else settles into place. Patient, careful, and sure that one day this tenderness will demand a price. Let your breaths keep the same slow measure as before. Breathe in the patience of the world. Breathe out the small comforts you have been carrying. Imagine the settlement once more, the rails that ring faintly through the night, the lamps at the edges of the hab blocks that glow like patient fireflies. The rhythms are unchanged at first. The engines hum, the conveyors sigh, the watchmen punch their times. It is easy to think nothing has shifted, but listen closer. For subtle wrongness gathers itself like condensation upon a window, and what begins as a mist will not be denied. The first signs are private things, almost embarrassments. A man returns from the shaft with eyes that hold the light too avidly. In the lamplight, they seem to shine as if polished. He is careful with his hands. He mistrusts open air for reasons he cannot name. Friends notice he does not blink as they do, that his gaze lingers on certain corners of rooms and then slips away with a quickness that makes the listener uncomfortable. People say he is a good worker. They say the light might simply be the reflection from a new lens he was fitted, or the sweat that catches a torch's glare. It is easier to say such things. It is easier than asking the question the eyes provoke. Elsewhere, children are born who do not look quite like other children. In a hatchery ward, a nurse laughs at first when a mother shows her the baby's hands. They are long-fingered, with an extra, short digit tucked surprisingly near the thumb. The nurse brushes the anomaly away with the practiced joke of a tired profession. Genetic variance, she says, and the words are both salve and deflection. The registry clerk records it as an unusual appendage and moves on. Later, when another child is born with a web of extra skin between the fingers, the laughter is quieter. The midwife's throat tightens. A foster aunt hums an old lullaby and presses a hand to the baby's brow as if to cool a fever, though there is no fever to cool. Small things pile into a pattern no one wants to name. Vanishing is the sort of thing that the community can accommodate only by wrapping it in explanations. You say a man walked out in a storm and never returned. You say he took the long corridor to the ventilation guts and simply did not come back. Sometimes a body is found, mangled against a corroded pipe. Sometimes a shift man is registered as absent, a name that vanishes from a roster as if struck by a pen. The families make altars, say prayers, and place a token on the threshold. The foremen issue memos. The investigator who is sent often returns with a patient shrug and a report that blames the usual culprits. Caving shafts, equipment failure, drunkenness in a world that drinks because it must. The ledger is smoothed. The outcry becomes a small, private grief instead of a public emergency. But even the ledger cannot account for every missing thing. Sometimes the absence is subtler. A box that should be on the supply shelf but is not. A crate misnumbered. A child's small toy found in a tunnel where no child should be. A loader will tell you of a time when an entire cart seemed empty until it reached the lift, and then, inexplicably, was heavier on the down ramp than it had been on the way up. He chalks it up to miscounting. He does not tell the others about the scent that rose when he opened the crate. Not oil, not rot, but something like the warm hush of animal fur and a cold, metallic tang that made his nose sting. Vox transmissions begin to flinch. They do not fail outright. They stutter as if remembering to breathe. A morning report on the municipal frequency will falter for the barest second, and beneath the announcer's voice, there will be a sound like many people inhaling at once. The maintenance yards call it interference and assign a junior tech to the case. The tech reports that a minor feed from a relay shows harmonics that do not belong to any standard modulation. He draws up charts and hands them to a senior engineer. The senior engineer cups his chin and says, "Strange harmonics happen," and puts the charts into a drawer. The drawer is locked. The key is a small consolation. Sometimes the interference becomes a voice, the sort of voice that is almost an instrument. It is not language at first. It is a harmonic that sits under speech like a second secret bass line. A merchant broadcasting prices will find his message tinted for a second, with a tone that makes his teeth feel off. A mother listening to a lullaby will hear, under the melody, a second colour, a phrase shaped like the old names her grandmother once sang in a tongue she never learned. The phrase lingers at the edge of comprehension and is gone. Those who notice feel a small chill and press a hand to their chests as if to steady themselves. Old women are not surprised by tiny anomalies like these. They keep the world's patchwork knowledge in their fingers and remember when seasons shifted in strange ways. They remember too that sometimes the earth remembers you back. One will tell you, "It's only a learning." She will say it absently as she knots a hem, as if reciting the weather. The phrase can be lip service. It can be superstition. It can also be a word for something more precise, a thing that tests and learns the rhythms of the place it will enter. And the place itself seems alive. The storms overhead run longer this season. The winds that cross the plateau take on a whining that grates in the teeth. Rain does not fall in simple sheets. It comes in waves, a pulsing that sounds as if the sky itself is clearing its throat. The ground below answers. In the deeper galleries, one may feel the earth breathe, a slow exhalation that lifts a dust flake from a bench and then lets it settle. Tunnels that have been stable for years will shift, a seam opening just enough to let coldness through. Machines that have sat in workshops for decades will start with a shiver and then enter a smoother, more efficient rhythm for a day, only to stop at an odd hour and refuse to begin again until soothed by hands that do not quite know why. The overseer, we will call him Brother Overseer Marius, though he prefers the simpler title of overseer, notices things that others do not. He has spent most of his life balancing tolerances and murmuring corrections into the ears of machinery. His hands have memory, the wrench that fits a bolt, the way a bearing yields before it breaks. He is a man of faith in the old ways of maintenance. He prays to the machine god with the same quiet devotion with which he greases an axle. The Adeptus Mechanicus gives him the language to say what needs saying. Calibration, servo mechanism, feedback loops. He uses it because it is precise and because precision is safety. For weeks, he attributes anomalies to fatigue. The men who work the night shifts are leaner now. The ration packets are less full. The cogs in their day-to-day are worn smooth. Marius files reports and stamps them. He orders half shifts and suggests more light in the tunnels. He speaks in tones of practical concern. He reroutes a pump. He calls the medic for a miner's strange tremor in the hand. He does not want anything larger to stand in the way of his work or of the small communities that rely on those pumps. Good governance, he tells himself, is the best prayer. But when he opens the maintenance log on a rainy morning to see a list of errors that have no mechanical cause, something cold brushes along the base of his skull. The log lists things that make no principled sense. An auger that quits, though the power feed was nominal. Sensors that report temperatures that do not exist. The maintenance cameras show a disturbance, a dark shape that moves under the lenses in a way that defies any recorded animal gait. The image is smeared and grainy. It looks for all the world like the after-image of motion. Marius studies the frames until they blur. He rubs his eyes and thinks of prayers he has not said. He is not alone in his unease. Sister Jaina, a technician attached to the relays, notices the new harmonics as well. She is younger and less practiced in the art of composure. She tells Marius of a transmission she captured late at night. A Vox packet that, under analysis, displays a modulation that would be efficient for a non-human vocalization. She plays the clip for him in the quiet of the relay room. The sound is a low, rolling phrase beneath the static, and it seems to hitch at points that suggest an intelligence testing for syllabic breaks. Marius feels his stomach tighten. His first thought is the Mechanicus response, to isolate, to catalogue, to dissect. But his hands tremble when he reaches for the isolation protocol. The thought of quarantining a line that carries the voices of so many homes feels like denying someone a prayer. When the tech priests arrive from the nearest Mechanicum outpost, they bring instruments that hum in X-ray and in color. They move with a ritualistic thoroughness, anointed sensors, jotting of marks, the soft metallic tap of a calibrator. They are efficient, they are precise, yet even they frown. The senior Magos runs a finger along a chart and murmurs, "Frequencies cross the expected envelope." He deploys a probe that feeds back a pattern eerily like the biological signaling of chitinous arthropods. He calls it anomalous. He draws a small circle next to the data and writes a notation. That circle, for a man like Marius, is not a comfort. It is a warning. The religious sensibilities of the settlement strain against scientific curiosity. There are whispers that the machine god is being tested. There are others who say the emperor's favor has been misplaced. Men begin to cross themselves with keener insistence. The priests hold more vigils. The cult's hymns, already stitched into daily life, now thread in a lower tone. The family's own cadence seems to lock against the new noises like a shield. Its leaders move in closed circles and speak in clipped, careful phrases. It is as if two tides are running against one another. One of ritual security, the other of methodical analysis. Marius feels himself tugged in both directions. He believes in machinery's logic, but he also believes in people. The Mechanicum offers him a method. Symbols, devices, protocols. The social fabric asks for understanding, for kindness, for the preservation of labor and life. He reads reports in the afternoon light and prays at dawn. He listens to the recorded harmony in the evening and then takes his toolbox to the shaft at midnight. His chest tightens when the new patterns begin to echo in the shaft's piping. A rhythm that answers the low hum of the pumps with a counter-rhythm that is not mechanical. He stands in the gloom and feels the hair on his arms tremble as if the pipes themselves listened. Children are drawn to the small wrongnesses with a hunger that is at once innocent and dangerous. One little boy, Tolan, disappears from a sleeping bunk only to be found hours later at the mouth of a drainage tunnel, his fingers damp with water and his eyes reflecting a grin that is too old for his age. He returns with a smear of black along his nails and a token, a small polished stone with a notch carved so fine only a practiced hand could make it. He is hesitant to explain where he was. When pressed, he recites a rhyme he claims his friend taught him. The rhyme contains a cadence no one else recognizes until Sister Gina, hearing it on the child's lips, feels a distant echo of the harmonics she captured in the relay room. The overlap is small, a coincidence perhaps, but coincidences in a series begin to feel like design. Men who have been helped by the family find themselves protective in ways they did not expect. The foreman who received an extra ration when his wife was sick will be the first to dismiss the new anomalies. He will tell you the earth is settling. He will say that when you have people to feed, you do not indulge in speculation. He thinks of his family's table and the small savings his gratitude brings. The defense is not mendacious. It is a necessary armor. There is punishment in losing the network that once helped you. And that willingness to deny doubt is a practical survival instinct as much as it is faith. Yet, other folk are not so easily persuaded. A miner named Loris speaks of a time when his lamp flickered and, for an instant, the shadows in the shaft bent in a direction that no natural light could account for. He tells of how a drill pulled itself loose from its mount, as if by an invisible hand. He speaks about the cold that sits in the mouth of tunnels, a cold that is unrelated to weather and that makes metal teeth clatter. His hands tremble when he recounts it. He leaves a cup of ale untouched at the bar and stares at the doorway as if expecting something to step through. When he visits his wife at night, he tucks the blanket in closer. Such stories spread not as contagion, but as sediment. Thin layers of unease deposited on top of the world's ordinary weight. People begin to choose their paths with a new care. Routes are altered to avoid a hollowed gallery. Children are kept closer to the hearth. Men who once lingered on break with jokes now speak in shorter sentences. A woman who had once volunteered to fetch tools for a neighbor now thinks twice. The civic rhythm slows by increments. Each impatience paused until further notice, and still the earth suggests more. The ground heaves under a cart at dusk and reveals a node in the rock, a sulcus of dark stone with hairline cracks that exude a sap-like residue. The residue is viscous and oddly luminescent, its glow faint like a dying star. A sample is taken and put under a lens. The analyst reports odd cell walls and chitinous shapes in formation. The word xenos is not used aloud in the open market, but it whispers around corners and finds its way into the hush of late-night conversations. Naming such things conjures authority, and authority in small settlements is as dangerous as fire. There are nights when the storms push in so hard, the lamps outside the hab blocks go out all at once. In that hush, the settlement holds its breath. The wind argues with itself on the roofs. Rain drums the corrugated sheets like 1,000 nervous fingers. In that weather, the tunnels below carry a higher frequency of movement. Boots pass in the corridors at odd hours. Figures shift beneath the machinery. And from the maintenance rooms come the small sounds of tools moved and doors latched. People whisper and count and search for meaning in the rhythm. On one such night, Marius is woken by a call from Sister Gina. "There's a signature on the line," she says. Her voice is paper-thin with fear. The relay room had recorded, half an hour earlier, a sequence of pulses that match a pattern Marius has seen only in biological signaling charts. Neural firing patterns shaped like a beckoning hand. He slogs through the rain to the relay and stands with her in front of the screen. The pulses blink in green. Marius thinks of the doctrine of the Mechanicum, that the universe is a machine to be read. He thinks of the hymns sung in the temple above ground. He tries the same methodical sanity in his own mind. If these are signals, then decode them. If they are patterns, chart them. If they are anomalous, isolate them. But he also hears in his blood the softer logic of community. To pull the covers over a child, to close a door without explanation, to protect what is fragile. He walks the line between those logics with the cautious steps of someone who has always fixed what could be fixed. When the first official investigation reaches the settlement, it is not the Inquisition that comes, but a small delegation, a magos and his 2 acolytes with tools that smell of ozone and cold metal. They move like surgeons. They take samples with gloved hands and note the presence of an organic tape beneath a conduit's insulation, a delicate filament that contains proteins and a weave of chitinous scales. Marius watches them as if watching sacrament. He wants their authority. He needs it. He also feels the muscle of fear tighten in his chest as the Magos turns a cold, professional gaze on the settlement. The Magos' reports are careful. He writes of genetic anomalies and of a pattern of social clustering around certain households. He notes the notches and the whispered hymns. He calls the phenomena a localized infection of mimetic and biological properties. The words are precise, which makes them terrible. They carry the weight of machines recognizing a fault and the weight of law that must answer faults. He recommends a cleansing, a policy of quarantine, and of cataloguing all those with anomalous features. He suggests that wards be inspected and that certain children be examined for grafting. In the code the Mechanicum uses, this is not an order, but a suggestion. But suggestions in places without many safeguards become mandates. The suggestion meets practical resistance. The foremen and priests balk at having neighbours examined. They cite a shortage of staff, the needs of the shift, the harm to morale. A council meeting dissolves into a debate. Emergency measures will starve the community of its labour when they most need hands. Yet ignoring the problem might let it spread. The family's leaders sit silent at the edges, their faces implacable. They have no need to make noise. Their influence is woven into the decisions already. The more the magistrates argue, the more the family's own rhythms steer the outcome. In the end, action is partial. A roster is checked. A morning curfew is enacted. A few individuals are quietly removed for inspection. The removed do not all return. Families are given compensation, enough to feed them for a month, and told to trust the system. The trust is brittle. Some people sleep fitfully. Others, when the night is heavy with rain and the lanterns dim, whisper that containment will not unmake what is already grown. As the days unspool, the wrongness does not retreat. It improvises. New signs arise. Small animal kills found neatly stripped of flesh in the outer yards. Metal surfaces etched with notches that are not of human tool-making. A smell like old iron and rain that clings in doorways. A machine in the foundry pan suddenly and sprays molten slag in an erratic arc that could have killed a dozen. It spares people by small degrees. Its swing is precise in its cruelty. Someone says it was a fault and laughs too loudly. The laugh is brittle. Sister Jaina records everything she can. She keeps a ledger of oddities, timestamps, and a cross-reference to hymn chants. Her handwriting gets cramped at the edges. She plays the harmonics and slows the recordings until the strange phrase becomes almost recognizably a rhythm and repeats, like a child's refrain taught over and over. The repetition makes it more plausible, more meaningful. Some nights, she hears the pattern in the beating of her own heart. The child Tolan begins to change in ways that defy pediatric charts. His skin grows cooler to the touch, and his fingers lengthen imperceptibly in the nights, as if the sleep has rearranged bone. He speaks of tunnels with undue fondness and draws them on scraps of paper with careful lines that are not maps, but instructions. His parents laugh and pinch his cheek and call him their little lamp. They shave the dark smudge from under his nails and tuck him in and cross themselves more neatly than they used to. They do not suspect the depth of the root already weaving through the family soil. If there is a single sound that now becomes a secret companion to the settlement, it is the whisper that one hears only when alone, an undercurrent of breath beneath the sound of the world. It is as if someone has put a hand under the community's ribs and is learning how to make the lungs work. In the quiet moments, the pause between kettles boiling and the clang of routine, one can hear it. At first, it is a small shame to admit it. Then it becomes an obsession. The early horror is not the monstrous spectacle of a day's battle. It is the patient twist of normality into otherness. It bends prayers into a private language that only half sounds like faith. It makes work into ritual and ritual into engineering. It smooths the edges until the unbelievable can be worn like a coat. Those within its warmth call it kindness. Those without feel the cold. Marius, who has always believed in the solvability of things, begins to read the world as a ledger that cannot, ultimately, be balanced by mere maintenance. He goes into the tunnels with boots heavier than his authority, and he notices things with a careful eye. The soft ridges in the rock that match the notch patterns he has seen on coins. The slight depressions in a doorframe that show where something small once took hold. He returns from these forays with his hands smelling of that strange sap, and with his mind made raw by the inability to reconcile his sacred machinery with what his eyes report. He prays at the edge of sleep and finds his words choosing words he had never studied. Family, seed, graft. The settlement tightens around its secret like a hand closing on a piece of cloth. No one can say when the quiet will break into something else, only that the quiet has already been altered. The machine's hum has new harmonics. The prayers meter has shifted by a half beat. The world alters not by sudden dismantling, but by 1,000 small edits. The sort of edits that are invisible when read one page at a time. And in the places under the ground where torchlight trembles and water beads on stone, something listens. It learns the cadence of human breathing and mutters a phrase that sounds like a lullaby, but whose syllables end not in comfort, but in a patient request. It repeats the phrase until the children hum it back in their sleep. It tucks its rhythm into the pipes and into the wiring and into the bones of the place until the settlement itself will not be able to remember how it sounded before the new chorus joined. Stand a while in that hush and let your breath slow to match. Feel the first pricklings of unease, not as a cliff to be feared, but as a current underfoot. The early horror is careful. It is content to be near you and not make a scene. It prefers the long game. It can wait while you feed and clothe your family. It can wait until harvest or shift change. It can wait until you have the time to listen properly. Remember the sound that now underlines everything. Not a shout, but a whisper of biology in the circuitry. Not a scream, but a cadence that invites answer. It is patient. It is learning. And the night, the storm and the ground and the pipes. Lean closer to hear how we will respond. Notice how the breath that has kept you company through these pages now goes a little quicker. That is what the world does when a new tempo takes hold. It borrows your lungs and borrows your pulse and keeps time with whatever it is that has learned to count. The settlement's slow music, the clatter of rails, the murmur of conveyors, the flat, disciplined murmur of men and women who know the shape of their days, begins to pick up a staccato undercurrent. What was once a background hum thickens into a tide. The family's rituals come out into the open. No longer content with whispers in the deep rooms, they find ways to dress their rites in the language of community. Where before a secret hand might tuck a token beneath a heel, now tokens are set beside loaves at mealtimes and left upon the thresholds of the infirmary. The weekly maintenance briefing becomes a procession. Workers line the corridor and, between the distribution of tools, a brief invocation is spoken aloud. People come to see what comfort there is in a familiar cadence. And when they hear the words, only slightly altered, only a shadow off the liturgy they have always known, they take heart. Some will say it is a blessing for safe labor. Others will say it is a formalization of the kindness they have always felt in the neighborhood. The fact of public performance convinces by its very normality. The songs that were once hummed in the gallery rooms develop harmonies meant to fill large spaces. Torchlit processions thread through the industrial quarters with banners that are small, unassuming, stitched with emblems that look like maker's marks, until a line of the stitch forms a shape that makes the eye pause. Children who once played at the edges of those processions now march with solemn faces and small beads clutched in their hands. Their steps are neat, measured, taught perhaps, but taught with the gentle firmness of someone who has learned to count on the future. The music is soft, but its volume is communal. The walls of the foundry catch it and send it back, and between the clatter of metal, the hymn grows into something like a vow. When worship becomes public, so does conviction. Men who had accepted the family's favors without thinking now declare themselves openly. They stand at the edges of lines in the forecourts and recite the phrases they have learned. Their voices are not loud, but they are confident, and confidence breeds imitation the way a lantern draws moths. A foreman who had been skeptical finds himself repeating a prayer because the cadence steadies him, and because the workforce is less fractious when people are sure of what they mean. The family's leaders walk among these crowds and smile with the measured patience of those who understand momentum. Once people trust there is benefit in believing, the cost of believing shrinks, and then the machines begin to disagree. It happens in stages that make it impossible to ignore. A conveyor belt clatters and slips, shuddering to stops that no oil change will explain. Pumps that have pushed water and coolant for decades falter and then gasp as if someone has caught their throat. Servitors in the maintenance yard, those patched, half-animated machines that croon their work in the voice of the Adeptus Mechanicus, slow and shiver as if remembering an older lullaby. Lights in whole sectors go dim and then die as if the settlement itself has been allowed to take a breath, and, in that breath, chosen not to continue. Where there is silence, people notice. Where there is silence, there is fear. The silence is not merely the absence of sound, but a heavy thing that changes the tone of speech, makes voices small and guarded. Men go to the control rooms and find panels dark, though the power feed reads green. Engineers climb into the guts of machines with lamps on their helmets and find surfaces that have been laid with a film like dried sap, that same viscous residue Marius once collected. And under it, tiny shapes gleaming like seeds. When devices are pried open, the shapes are revealed to be small, hardened nodules irregular as barnacles, as if something had chosen the machines as a cradle. Worse still are the failures that behave with intention. A press in the metalworks begins a cycle and then hammers in a rhythm that is not the prescribed one. It pauses at the small gap where a worker's finger might be, and then, with cruel timeliness, continues. An entire block of lights will flare, as if to reveal everything, and then snuff out in a pattern that suggests patterning rather than accident. Where accidents used to have the randomness of entropy, these malfunctions have design. Someone who studies failures for a living, a man who has rebuilt turbines in 3 systems and whose hands remember torque the way. Birds remember migration, will swear that a machine's insistence slotted the world into a different grammar. He will sit in taverns and stare at his palm and feel stupid the way men feel when the ground gives a laugh at their certainties. In the quiet that follows mechanical collapse, people look at one another differently. Where once a neighbor was a smooth-edged presence, now there is the nagging suspicion of not having known the person at all. The changes are at first small and intimate. A commander's brow will bow at an odd angle. An overseer's voice will take an unexpected rasp. A matron who ran the soup line for decades will blink and find that the pattern of her knuckles has shifted. These are things that friends will try to explain away. Fatigue, age, stress. The logic of denial is a useful thing. It maintains work rhythms and keeps the bread from stopping. But denial is porous. It will not hold against the tide when the tide bears teeth. Bodies begin to tell a different story. It is not thunderous at first. There is no sudden parade of monsters, but an accumulation of half-hidden, intimate horrors. Workers report waking with abrasions that bloom like tiny shields beneath the skin, raised ridges that harden into pale plates and then crack like old paint. A mother will come to the infirmary with a child who coughs, and then coughs again with a sound that seems to pick up resonance from somewhere not human. The cough leaves behind scales in a tissue, and when a lab lamp is trained upon them, they glint with an iridescence that seems to eat the light. The hybrid forms begin as whispers, the extra joint behind a thumb, an eyelid that closes oddly, a palate that is too elastic. Then they expand into the grotesque with intimate specificity. There is a man named Havel who worked the ore presses and whose fingers were tools in their own right. He starts to wake with his hands aching, and the ache compels him to hold them near the furnace until the heat draws out a new formation. A thin, pale membrane that bridges web-like between knuckles, delicate and translucent. At first, he hides it under gloves and jokes about catching a cold. Then the membrane dries and takes on a slight cartilage feel, and the joke dies in his throat. Others find growths that are not merely tissue, but the early suggestions of armored growth. Hard ridges along a shoulder, a pectoral plate folding over a sternum, a small hooded swelling at the base of the skull that pulses when the moon is thick. Once a formation begins to take, the body rearranges itself in service of it. Tendons slacken in places where they once punched. Muscles pull in new directions. Biomechanic adaptations appear as if sculpted by an outside hand. The most honest and practical among the population, those who spend their days measuring tolerances and wear, begin to understand that whatever alters a human here works with the same art as a smith making a spoon, increments and repetitions until a new shape is achieved. Some transformations are beautiful in the terrible, way things are beautiful when they are new and wrong. A woman with a voice like a kettle will find that it gains a harmonic below human registers. When she sings, the plates along her neck vibrate and make the sound fuller, like a chorus augmented by a bell. People who listen feel older and empty and somehow less worthy. Beauty in this place functions like a lure. It draws attention, and attention makes a safe nest for other changes to occur. By now, the psychology of the settlement tightens into two hemispheres. One side, those who have been touched by the family's care, those who have benefited from its favors, sees the changes as proof of a future, as the marking of a chosen lineage. To them, a seeded callus is evidence of continued favor. A strange harmony in a voice reads as a sign of purpose. They cradle these changes and name them with affectionate words, as if calling a wound by a pet name. The other side, those who have not been chosen, or who have watched loved ones altered without consent, feel a growing anger and dread. They begin to speak of them with a quiet edge, and in the edge lives the shape of fear, turning toward reprisal. What makes the crescendo unbearable is not only the physical alteration, but the betrayal of recognition. People who have shared bread now cross to the other side of a lane because the mouth set is wrong. A sergeant who led patrols now answers commands with an inflection that suggests he is listening to a different officer in his head. The subtle betrayals are the hardest to survive. The friend who has learned to look at you as if they have seen a map on the underside of your skin and knows the route out. The neighbor who pauses before inviting you to a ration line. The social contract phrase as each alteration demands its own language and secrecy. The family's spread becomes tactical. It is not the chaotic sweep of rabid zealots, but the patient, surgical advance of a careful organism. Units of workers who have been converted take over key supply rooms by being the ones who always know where a missing part can be found. New foremen quietly favor men who speak the family's cadences. A militia squad that used to patrol the perimeter will, in time, be commanded by a captain with a small, unnatural notch in his ear. A notch that, to the converted, reads like authority. They do not announce their loyalties. They perform them with a quiet efficiency so that when they are called into action, the call will seem inevitable. The public sphere is tuned. A festival becomes a recruitment drive. A charity becomes a means of mapping households that can be relied upon. The cult's leaders, not outwardly monstrous, not screaming tyrants, but practical and warm faces, begin to put men in positions of quiet power. The medical officer, who was once a complacent bureaucrat, now ensures certain children attend the evening catechism. The housing clerk leaves doors open for favoured families during inspections. In these small favours, the cult secures the scaffolding it needs to move from shadow to prominence. People who have lost much and gained the small mercies begin to fear the alternative and speak of loyalty in the same way they might speak of a warm coat in winter. Resistance grows, but it is fragmented. Those who fear the change band together in whispered meetings and argue for intervention. A cleansing, a purge, a formal appeal to higher authorities. The elders write petitions and send them through the proper channels, praying that the ledger of the Mechanicum or the Inquisition will tilt toward justice. But bureaucracy moves like a glacier here. Reports are answered with forms, with delayed visits, with the polite language of deferral. The family has exploited this slowness. While the system debates, the architecture of conversion deepens. It is the old predator's trick. Wait until the flank is weak, then take the ground. The psychological space between people grows warier. Paranoia noisily scratches like rodents in the walls. Men check their boots for marks. Mothers examine the skin of their children and whisper of signs that might be dismissed by a medic's lamp. Lovers find doubt in the too conscientious care of a hand held by a partner who has received favors. Conversations that once hummed now lurch into silences where context used to be made. The mind, when given uncertain evidence, crafts stories to fill the gap. Those stories become new lenses through which the world is read. Sometimes an act of violence fractures the silence and makes everyone reconfigure. A patrol, supposed to sweep an empty warehouse, finds a nest. A cramped space lined with a carpet of chitin and hair, with eggs tucked in like dull pearls. The patrol's corporal, a man who had once laughed easily, reaches out with gloved fingers because it is his job, and an egg opens like the eye of a thing imagining light for the first time. The sound is not a cry, but a wet unwrapping, and the men are ill-equipped to handle the sight of something that is both animal and intentionally arranged. One tries to strike it with a baton, and the baton curls as if through water. Another vomits on the floor. The patrol burns what remains, but the photographs are taken, evidence catalogued, and the photographs are the sort of thing that changes how neighbors look at one another. Rumors spread faster than facts. The family's influence seeds whispers that the men who were found near the nest were themselves traitors, that a pestilence was being contained. The other corners of the settlement argue. Some demand public purges, others demand caution. The division hardens from debate into clans. Where once the community had a neat geometry of tasks and tables, it becomes a map of trenches and alliances, and the one who knows the least finds himself in the cold. At the nadir of the crescendo, the settlement seems to lose its scale. Blocks fall silent. Sectors are shuttered. The foundry's giant bellows, starved of technicians and moved by new hands, begin to chant in a rhythm that no engine metric can justify. Voices rise and thin and then are joined with newer voices. A layered chorus that has the human consonants and a strange undersyllable like stones struck in damp places. It is the music of something learning to be sung and choosing chords that are, somehow, both mechanical and biological. And in the dark that follows the closing of 1,000 doors, the family's true confidence shows itself. They march in quiet columns, not with the clatter of brigands, but with the steady, careful tread of those who have all the time in the world to take what they want. They direct the flow of food to favoured neighbourhoods. They set curfews that everyone obeys because the militia has been discreetly replaced. And they mark those who will be brought into the fold. In the great hall where the magistrates once deliberated, they hold a gathering that is equal parts sermon and census. The magistrates attend because the lines are neat and the logic is secular. Keep the peace, assign resources, avoid panic. They do not see that every ledger the family touches comes out with an invisible signature. Marius watches these changes with a grief that is close to animal. He has always been a man who thinks problems are parts to be taken apart and put together more honestly. Now he listens to the new choruses and cannot find the schematic. He goes to the maintenance yards and sees men with soft plates along their fingers, pressing their palms to the salvaged engines, and he cannot say whether they are healing or killing them. He returns at dawn to the shade of his flat and kneels by the lamp and tries to name what has happened. His prayers feel like a calibration ritual with missing steps. The crescendo has an architecture, a pattern of rising, of saturation, of revelation. It does not end in a single cry. It ends by making the ordinary unbearable. The familiar world is retooled into a stage for the new order. Where once the settlement had room for disagreement, it now demands accommodation. Where once neighbors could argue over rations, they now have to account for the way children hum in their sleep. And always at the center of this swelling, there is the chant, soft at first, then wide, then unmistakable. The family's voices braid with the mechanical murmurs until you cannot tell whether it is the hymn that borrows the cadence of machine or the machines that adopt the hymn's slow, patient insistence. In that braided song, there is a promise clear and dreadful. You will belong, or the belonging will be achieved by other means. Stand with Marius for a moment in that hush. Feel the machine's halted breath, the unforgiving press of the night, the smell of heated metal and dried sap. Listen to the hymn as it presses against the walls and through the seams until the whole settlement seems to resonate with it. You can close your eyes and remember a time when the engines simply hummed. You can remember the smell of the kettle on a morning that had no little teeth at the edge. But the recollection becomes a private thing, a small relic. Outside, the family grows louder. It is patient, efficient, sanctified in a way that ordinary charity isn't. The crescendo does not scream its arrival so much as set the world on a new setting. Its sound is familiar enough to be trusted, and strange enough to make you step back. What was once a petal now has a thorn. What was once a neighbor now wears a mark. And as the hymn reaches its high, the machines that kept the settlement ordinary fail with a deliberation that is almost polite. They fail so that what replaces them can be loved for being necessary. When the hymn swells and the last bellows hush, the settlement is different in a way that cannot easily be reversed. The family is no longer hidden, and the community that remains must choose whether to accept the strange fruit offered or to fight for a future that may no longer exist. Somewhere beneath the torchlight and the cold iron, something has set down a root. It waits, it thrives, and it has now learned how to sing in a chorus that the whole settlement can hear. Listen to that chorus. It is loud enough to make the hairs on your arms stand, and soft enough to make your pulse sync with its line. It is the place where belonging and domination become the same instrument. The crescendo has peaked, but the silence it leaves behind is thicker than any sound. In that silence, decisions will be made, not always by people. And when those decisions are taken, the world will tilt again. For now, the torches gutter and the hymn continues. The machines lie still in the hollow of their tired bellies. The people, some altered, some obstinate, some already converted, move through the dark like ghosts who have learned their new names. And somewhere in the deeper galleries, where the water finds its slowest drop, the sound of a new thing being formed answers their hymn with its own patient cadence. Begin, as the years have taught you, with a breath that is steady and wide. You have leaned on the rhythm of the world for long enough to know its safe contours, to trust the tick of pumps, the creak of beams, the measured footsteps along a passageway. Let that breath fill you once, deep, slow, and then let it go. What follows will not be polite. The first true sign is not in the earth, it is in the sky. For nights the heavens had been a distant burnished thing, a field of patient lights. You could name constellations the way you name old friends. The stars were familiar, the same slow companions that had watched over work shifts and lullabies. But one dawn, when the first shift is still rubbing sleep from their eyes, the sky over the settlement flares. It is a light that does not come from the sun, an eruption, white at its core, like a wound in the dark. People wet their lips and look up. The light is wrong. It expands without the natural softness of dawn. It shudders, and then the stars around it go out in a slow, meticulous dimming, as if someone had swept a hand across a switchboard. The first reports are clinical. A scanner from the orbital buoys flags a mass. A signal pings from a distant navigational buoy and returns a corrupted vector. The Mechanicum's relay shows anomalies in the angular velocity and mass signature. Unknown object, transiting with high mass and rapid course correction. The word unknown lands like a pebble in clear water, and ripples outward until the ripples become waves. People puzzle over terms they have never needed to ask before. Hive Fleet, breathes a voice who has read the long-suppressed histories. An elder who used to trade in faded star charts. Somewhere a child repeats the phrase without understanding, and the word finds its way like a seed into a thin, dry soil. When the first shadow crosses the planet, it is not the slow day-night cycle you have learned to live by. It is a moving absence that eats light. People stop mid-task and look up with mouths parted. The shadow is enormous. It slides over the face of the sun itself, and the sun shrinks as if coy, the way you shrink yourself against an approaching tide. Winds that had been whining for weeks drop for a moment and then seethe into a howl. Alarms, those half-mournful things that used to be ignored for lack of time, begin to wail in a new register. The rhythm of the world is smashed into staccato. Marius, who has always preferred the geometry of torque and the tidy logic of maintenance, stands on the roof of the maintenance yard and watches as a shape larger than memory hangs above the atmosphere. It is not a vessel in the traditional sense. It is a living architecture, a dark bloom, a cathedral of exoskeletal plates and writhing armature. Its silhouette makes the stars around it look small by contrast. Across the valley, processions stop mid-chant, and the hymns curdle into the same sound, bewilderment, and a kind of religious awe. There had been hints, those small wrongnesses that crept in like ivy, but nothing in them suggested the scale of this arrival. The family had spoken of the seed and the line, of graft and promise. No one had said the seed was an invitation card for an entire gale of mouths. The orbital defences, old, bureaucratic, poorly provisioned, flare and answer. Batteries that have slept for generations wake with the bitterness of old soldiers, and for a time there are streaks of light like angry needles in the sky. They bloom close to the approaching shape, and burn away into puffs of nothing that are devoured by the thing's armour, as if it were a hand closing over a fly. Star shells detonate like a cluster of artificial lightning, and on the ground, the settlement watches the heavens bloom with false triumph. When the explosions die, the night above is unchanged, except for the increase of shadows, and a terrible hush falls in which the world seems to listen to what it has done. The first descent is not a crash. There is a noise impossible to describe with any face-saving dignity, like the sound of 1,000 bodies shifting within a single terrible organism. It is a living sound, a chewing of space. A meteor of black scales strikes the upper atmosphere, and the skies over the planetary ring flare with fire. Heat washes the roofs, singeing banners and curling edges of corrugated sheets. The settlement's lamps flicker and then go out as the electromagnetic interference bites into the grid. Where the generators sputter and the servos jam, people stumble. The hymners quiet. The family's leaders stand on balconies and call for calm, their words small against the roar. From the impact sites rise swarms. They pour like a living flood down the world's flanks, through the valleys, into the gullies where water had been stored for months. They are many shapes, each as purposeful as a tool and as mindless as hunger. Limbs lash like crude crane hooks. Carapaces shine wet and oily. More plates fold backward to reveal inner mandibles that click like the closing of 1,000 gears. Most horrible of all, they are not a single kind, but a multiplicity. Small, fast things that scuttle with spidery speed. Larger beasts that crush the bones of structures. Armored behemoths that belch spores like curtains. At first, people hoped for defense. Trained militia, explosive stores, an order from higher command. But the defenses, the militia, the factories that once produced ordnance, are compromised not only by the creatures but by people. The family's influence, which had softened the ground for their advance, becomes the final lethal convenience. Doors that should be locked are open. Watchmen who had been paid by the family falter and do not raise alarm. Units that might have rallied to an organized response hesitate. Their discipline reshaped by whispers, by the taste of favors that kept families fed. The invasion is not simply a military event. It is a social unmaking. The first human-to-creature contact changes the world forever. The swarm does not always tear into flesh with immediate, brutish efficiency. Sometimes it offers a gentleness that makes the onlooker's eyes go wet with disbelief. It will cuddle a child with its forelimbs, fold a mother's shoulders into a cushioned carapace, stroke the hair of a converted man who weeps with a joy as if he had been reunited. There is an intimacy in the violence that complicates how you would name the deed. When they touch those who have been sung to by the cult's hymn, the creature's contact is not tearing, but a slow grafting. Their carapace breathes on the skin, and the skin responds with a strange pliancy. Tissue softens and bone warms. New nodules root at the base of ribs and membranes spread between shoulder blades. The thing called blessing in the tunnels has been a summoning, and now the summoned arrive not to worship, but to harvest. The families openly offered kindness, extra rations, safe berths, a closed door, had prepared many as the first hosts. Those who had been chosen, whose calluses had been softened into notches, and whose hymns had been tuned to an alien cadence, welcomed the arrival with smiles of serene absorption. They step forward and press their hands into the exoskeletons with a devotion that fractures the hearts of watchers. "We are ready," they murmur. They smile with unhuman teeth. Marius, who had spent long nights submitting reports and arguing for measured responses, finds himself in a different kind of calculus. He stands with Sister Jaina on the roof of the clinic and watches a woman he had known since apprenticeship take a step into the maw of a smaller creature and, with wondering absence, let herself become something else. The woman's fingers elongate like roots being set into new soil. Her voice takes overtones and her face relaxes into rapture. Marius feels the stomach clench of betrayal, of not having been told the truth about what the family's choice meant. He had seen badges, had seen the notches. He had not expected the body to rewrite itself in open daylight. Psychological collapse is as swift as the first descent. The settlement's structures of trust, the breadlines, the work rosters, the rotation of watch shifts, rearrange themselves overnight into a geography of avoidance. People who have not been touched by the family build barricades with whatever they can, and the barricades are earnest and foolish. Sheets of corrugated metal, lifts braced with crates, the bodies of those who stand to block a doorway. Those who had stood in the inner circles of the hymners try to help the family's new charges, or they simply weep and hum. The mix of tenderness and horror makes a new kind of grief. The grief in which you cannot find an enemy to hate because part of you wants to join. Above and below, flesh merges with technology in ways that would have once been heresy. Servitors, those half-dead machines with meat for fuel, are not spared. The swarm treats them like scaffolds. Limbs are grafted into steel, muscle threaded through pistons, nerves married to cold hydraulic feedback. The Mechanicum's instruments cry in the halls as they note these unions. Their interface readouts jump between logic and an ugly poetry as they record synaptic patterns that mirror control algorithms. A brain, long amputated of certain freedoms, becomes an excellent controller for a hybrid limb that does not permit dissent. Where the Adeptus Mechanicus had once sought to machine man into obedience with ritual and bolt, the invasion accomplishes the task with a speed and elegance that is terrifyingly efficient. Warp whispers begin at the edges and then find their way into the ducts. They are not crude invocations at first, but a layering of thought threads that hum under sleep. Men who have never been given to dreams find themselves visited by precise images, starless galleries where new life is folded like laundry, the taste of iron and fecundity on the tongue, a name that slips into mind and seems both memory and command. The whispers are not always audible. They are often a pressure that sits against the inside of the skull, like a thumb held there by a hand you cannot see. Those touched by the cult seem to bear the whispers gladly, as confirmation. Those who had resisted hear them as nails tapping from the other side of a coffin. The world's infrastructure begins to fail in systemic cascades. Where the family had once ensured access to spares, the new creatures now harvest those spares and graft them into nests. Turbo generators are perforated and used as chimneys. Hydraulic pumps become the bellows for biological growths that inflate and expel spores into the ventilation shafts. Pipes seam open and exude resin that smells like warm iron, and the resin hardens into lattice structures that hum. The settlement's once proud data vaults fill with a soft mass that digitizes and then reinterprets human memory into pulsed signals. The memory is not destroyed but rewritten into hymns sung in a different key. Engineers who try to salvage critical systems find themselves contending not only with physical obstacles, but with the seductive logic of repair that the invading intelligence teaches, an algorithm that says, graft what you have, and the machine will function differently, more usefully. For the new order, resistance organizes in the narrow, furious ways of those faced with annihilation. Men and women who had spent life smoothing machine parts now hone them into weapons. Priests who had prayed for preservation of souls now pray only to buy hours. The militia, once a collection of civic men and weapons, becomes a ragged, improvisational force. They attempt an assault on an infested sector, and the slaughter is terrible and specific. Those who do not fall are changed. A captain who survives the breach returns home with his face half covered by a membrane that blinks like a lid over an extra eye. He does not speak much. He sleeps in the day as if recovering from an extended transmission. The worst of it is the small betrayals. A woman who had given the family flour now lies at the edge of a nest, cradling a clutch of eggs and crooning in a voice not hers. An older man who used to tell stories in the tavern now directs newly formed sentries with a soft, terrible smile. The family's leaders, those faces who had been human by any measure until now, stand in the center of gatherings, their skin glossy and patterned, their speech a mixture of old kindness and alien inflection. They look as if they have been offered everything they thought was theirs. Their eyes are no longer merely human. They reflect a depth that makes those who meet them want to lower their gaze. As the sky burns hotter with the Hive Fleet's proximity, the planet's nights are lit by the sweep of great shadows. Orbital reactors flare and then black out. Where once the Mechanicum could have called for aid, the fleet's movement and the film of organisms in the rings interfere with long-range comms. The world becomes a stage of isolated tragedies. Each settlement, a player, receives only the piece of the play that is nearest. The sense of cosmic care, the idea that there is a hierarchy that will intervene, dissolves into quiet, bureaucratic impotence. In that vacuum, the family and its patrons claim authority. Children, the wagons of the race, become the strangest heralds. Those called the Star Children are not born of one species in the simplistic sense. They are engineered by hunger and by ritual into beings who bear traits designed to survive. Where once a child's features were simply small and trusting, now some children wake from a sleep with an extra hinge behind the elbow, or with eyes that can track bioluminescent movement in ways no human organ was designed to do. A child will balance on a rail and watch the sky not with anxiety, but with expectation. And this expectation has the serenity of the certain. Parents who had sung lullabies to these children now find the lullaby answered by a whisper that is not human, and that carries the weight of translation. The last days of the settlement are not a single battle, but a catalogue of endings. The bakery burns while people shout prayers. A hatchery is turned into a nursery of chitinous pods. A data vault blossoms growths that sing memory in a language of clicking. People die in clumsy heroics and small private departures. Some go with song, some go with a soft coughing resignation. Marius spends his hours moving between the dying and the living, fixing what cannot be fixed, and wrenching open doors that will not open. Sister Jaina compiles lists of names and reads them aloud into a recorder in the moments when there is safety, so that the voices may be preserved if only as testimony. They speak with a clarity born of unrelenting fatigue and a grief that has no theatrical outlet. At last there is the moment of irrevocable understanding, not a revelation delivered upon the headscarf of a single priest, but a geometry of evidence that collapses inward. Maps of infection, depositions by survivors, the lab notes recording the chitinous nodules, the recordings of harmonics that match signals observed in the orbiting swarm, the family's hymns, once local and intimate, now patterned with the frequencies broadcast by the creatures in orbit. The song had always been an invitation. Each cadence, each notch, had been a measure of a door slowly unbolted. You understand then why the family had been tender. Tenderness was an instrument. The small favors were adhesives. The little kindnesses were offerings laid in place, long before metal and flesh would be stripped bare. Their theology had never been perverse in the abstract. It was functionally precise. To belong to the family was to be first on the list of harvests. They had practiced mercy with the same mechanical meticulousness the Mechanicum once used when fitting a cog. The cost to an ordinary life had been willingness. The willingness to accept membership, to become a node in a larger glutted tapestry. There is no clean, glorious end. There are pockets of defiant violence, and there are mass surrenders. By the time the last orbital pulse dies, and the Hive Fleet's shadow boils into a permanent twilight, the settlement is a new creature in every sense. Where streets had been, now runways for small, armored creatures. Where markets had been, now a carpet of small scales and exudations that pulse faintly with a bioluminescent life. The sky, that old friendly map, is a bruise stitched with the bones of foreign ships. Marius, Gina, and a shrinking band of survivors mount one last attempt to save the children. They gather the unaltered and the damaged alike in the clinic's basement and plan an exodus. A sealed lift to the orbital salvage, a cry for aid, a desperate attempt to move what can still be moved. The lift is an honest instrument. Thick doors, seals that have not been tested in months. They speak of rationing, of timing, of who will be left with the medicines and who will be carried. Their conversation is a ledger of compassion and terror. When they emerge into the courtyard, it has already been given over. The ground is a mosaic of footprints and carapace, a line of the family's chosen walk with the creatures, leading them in soft, ceremonial parade. Children hum the old hymns and then add new syllables. These syllables are the same as the harmonics that Sister Gina had recorded months before. They chant like a chorus that has learned the names of stars. The creatures sway as if to music. The final moments are not cinematic. There is no last stand speech or a clarion call that redeems everything. There is the lift. There is the decision. Marius watches a mother, one who had sewn his first apprentice badge, press her child into a creature's shell rather than hand him to the lift's line. She smiles at him with a sympathy that is almost unbearable. In that look, he reads not malice, but an understanding that to offer a child to the lift is to misery. To offer a child to the swarm is to give the child a place in the new order. She chooses what she can. He cannot judge. The lift doors close on a handful of survivors, and the cable groans upward. As it ascends, the settlement's silhouette opens, and there is a sound like 1,000 small mouths singing. The survivors look out to see the world below reconfiguring at the speed of hunger. Structures bend as if pulled. Metal shrieks in ways that sound like voices. The orbital buoy flashes one last scrambled call and then goes dark. The lift pierces the clouds into an evening that smells of ozone and ash. The survivors press their faces to the porthole and watch the settlement recede into a pattern of radiance and dark. They do not speak. Their silence is a kind of sacrament. Little children, those not yet altered, clutch at blankets and stare with eyes too young to carry such knowledge. A woman hums the old lullaby and then stops halfway when the missing syllable arrives, and she looks at the child beside her and sees that the child has already begun to hum the new phrase in answer. In the weeks and months that follow, the tale of this planet is reduced to lines and reports and the odd, hallucinatory account offered at tribunal hearings. Some documents blame the Mechanicum for failing to act. Others attribute the disaster to a lapse in the Imperial watch. The truth, when it can be spoken at all, is a more complex lattice of choices and failures. The family's patient work, the small mercies that had prepared the ground, the slow, methodical graft that transformed kindnesses into keys. Above the warp and far from the orbit of warm bodies, the Hive Fleet moves on. It is a living calculus of appetite and replication, a thing of breathtaking efficiency. This world was a node in its ledger, a place harvested in a moment that had been prepared by centuries. The survivors will carry that knowledge like a scar, that even tenderness can be a map to a mouth. And far below, in the places where torchlight once fell on careful hands, new voices sing. They are not the old hymns, and they are not quite inhuman. They are some braided thing of memory and consumption, a sound that folds the language of industry into the rhythm of appetite. The Star Children, the progeny of ritual and graft, will walk for a time under new suns and learn what it is to remember both lullaby and hunger. If there is any small consolation to be found in the embers, it is this: the survivors carry a record. Sister Gina's tapes, Marius's logbooks, the processed images of nodules, the names read into a recorder. They are a ledger that resists forgetting. Somewhere, in a cool repository, the truth of what happened sits in analog patience, waiting for ears that will listen with the right kind of outrage. But even as you close this chapter, know that the last sound you will carry from it is not the cost accountancy of those who file reports. It is the echo of a lullaby altered, a child's hum answered by a creature's low, corrugated response, a mother's smile folded under a carapace, the quiet certainty of those who were told they were chosen and who are now chosen in a way they never imagined. The sky is not quiet. It burns and it moves, and somewhere beyond the horizon the fleet writes its arithmetic across many worlds. They take seeds where they can find soil made of tender things. They do not hate, they consume. They are not wrath, they are appetite. The family, which began in a hand-sewn hymn, performed its part with the care of artisans. The price was human. The survivors who escaped will tell their tale, and the story will be studied and catalogued. and in some future ledger, men will trace the steps that lead to a city's undoing. But the stars will do as stars always do. Roll on. New light will fall. New hands will learn new rhythms. And in the dark between one world and the next, something will hum a phrase ancient and precise. We are coming. After the first shuddering days, after the bellies of the hills had been emptied, and the last of the lifts had shuddered into silence, the settlement ceased to be a place people could return to by remembering it exactly. Memory rearranged itself to make room for what had been lost. A breadline became a story about kindness. A foundry's roar became the sound a child made in sleep. Those who had left did not all leave with answers. They carried fragments, names, a scrap of hymn, a photograph half-eaten at the edges by smoke. And those fragments anchored their waking hours with the weight of testimony. The rest of the world wrote them down in bureaucratic ink or dismissed them in footnotes. Neither measure was sufficient. When the Hive descended in earnest, it did not do so with the theatre of cataclysm one expects from stories. It flowed, it folded, it unstitched. Entire neighborhoods became the scaffold for something new. Architecture of chitin and resin sprouted where roofs had been. Ventilation shafts became warm, pulsing conduits. The little alleys that had smelled of frying bread now smelled of iron and wet growth. The things that lived there moved with a patient, efficient appetite. They gnawed and grafted, and anything that could be integrated inevitably became part of the organism's logic. The human notion of property, the thing you could point to and claim as yours, ceased to be meaningful. The settlement's map was redrawn by appetite. Survivors spoke in small groups, as if the right size of grief was that which could be held across 2 laps and a table. They told of bargains struck in the dark. Who had given what so someone else could live? They told of the terrible generosity of those who had been converted, who had welcomed the swarm like an answer. The stories were not simple. There was tenderness folded into horror, a kind of moral arithmetic that made judgment messy. A woman had sewn an extra blanket for a neighbor the night the first shadows crossed. Later, when she was found among nests, she held that blanket like a relic and hummed with unearthly pleasure. For those who had not been taken, the memory of such gentleness was a blade that did not dull. The survivors who left in the lift and other vessels carried not only their bodies, but the sound of the place in their bones. When they tried to sleep in sterile quarters and on foreign decks, they hummed the old hymns, and sometimes a new syllable slipped in, too specific to be one's own invention, too precise to be forgotten. They burned what they could not bear, and filed what they could not trust to ashes. Their records were a patchwork, raw testimonies, clean Mechanicum reports, a box of Sister Gina's tapes, Marius's maintenance ledger, filings that read like a litany of small betrayals and patient engineering. What was left on the world, though, was not silence. The Hive did not simply swallow and go, it made a language of its own. The nests hummed with a chorus not intended for human ears. And when those sounds found the leaking vents of the orbital buoys, they bent into long-range pulses that carried a pattern. Outward into space, that pattern spoke as insistently as any prayer, carrying the memory of soil and song. In the husk of the city, the star children crawled and walked and learned their angles. On the new surfaces where human light met bioluminescence, they practiced the small gestures they had been taught. Their laughter, if one could call it that, was a cadence that folded hunger into lullaby. News travelled in a particular way after the fall. First, there were muted comms, the relay picking up only static and a rhythm that looked suspicious on any schematic. Then, farther out, rations were sent to supply a ship that never docked. Signals failed. The Imperium's gears, vast though they are, turned slow. A crisis registered in a docket and then queued. In those waits, the Hive feasted and grew. It was the quiet of institutions, not maliciousness, merely logistics, that was another kind of harvest. The world, once a node in a network of meaning and supply, became a ledger entry, loss on a page, then another page, then a closed file on distant stars. In ways that were both trivial and terrible, the family's echo persisted. Small cults elsewhere folded elements of their doctrine into their rites, a notched rivet here, a hymn cadence there. Traders carrying memorabilia, tokens of the old quaint practices of a backwater world, brought home souvenirs that were more infectious than they knew. A child on a freighter learns a rhyme in the mess and hums it again in the dark. A foreman in a distant manufactorum repeats a blessing that has a wrong lilt to it and finds that his men nod. In this manner, the family's syntax spread. not through grand proclamations, but through the tiny economies of help and habit by which people survive. That slow spread is the most disquieting truth. Survivors would whisper to one another in the safe rooms of later lives. The contagion had not been only biological, it was mimetic. It was kindness converted into leverage, mercy into invitation. A favor here, a saved ration there, little adhesions that bonded the living into networks primed for harvest. Somewhere between goodwill and obligation, the family's work had taught people to accept change as a form of care. That teaching outlived the bodies that first learned it. Over time, tribunals convened. They asked how much of this was negligence and how much was design. Experts debated whether the family had been willful collaborators or skilled preppers who misread the reach of what they summoned. The Inquisition and the Mechanicum argued with the language they had: containment, purge, quarantine, exorcism. Each word sounded both sterile and inadequate in the face of a thing that had grafted bone to piston and prayer to pulse. There were verdicts and there were punishments, but legal conclusions have a way of making the living feel small. Laws heal paper. They do not always soothe the heart. Some survivors dedicated themselves to remembering in order to prevent. They testified in chambers. They taught children the names of those gone. And they collected the hymns into a catalogue that read as a cautionary incantation rather than a devotional text. They collected the physical remnants, a shard of a tuned rivet, a poem torn and half burned, placing them behind glass in archives meant to educate. But archives are only useful to those who look. For others, the memory was a private thing, a knife and a map, and it reoriented how they moved through the universe. They would not sleep easily again. The stars, indifferent as ever, went on. Ships replanned routes, colonies shifted crops, governors issued decrees. The small human calendar encountered the geological clock, that vast tick of a sky that pays no attention to pity. But even in the rhythm of indifference, there are seams where the hive's pattern found purchase. A trader from some sleepy outpost would report a hymn hummed by a coalman on a far world. A father in a mining town would find his son returned from a long haul with new hands and a cheerful silence that worried him. These were the whispers that threaded through the Imperium's vast body, too small for immediate alarm, but large enough to unnerve. Perhaps the most troubling legacy is how easily the mechanics of care can be misunderstood. The family had not only taught that to be chosen was to be special, it recoded suffering as meaningful. The moral architecture it built let people transform tragedy into purpose, and purpose can make even the most horrendous choices feel like offerings rather than crimes. In that logic, a mother who offers her child is not a villain but a worshipper of a grotesque sort. She is a keeper of household logic who believes she is ensuring belonging. The ambiguity of that faith makes later judgment complicated. It is easy to speak of monsters when the other face is a woman with flour on her hands, humming a lullaby while a nest grows in her yard. You might think that the story ends with the last of the fires. It does not. The ending is smaller, subtler. It is found in the way a lullaby acquires a new syllable, and how a notch in a rivet becomes a mark of belonging in a place many light years away. It is found in the way a trader's child learns the new cadence and sings it in a cramped mess hall, and a ship's crew smiles at the oddity until, over months, the oddity becomes a habit. Habits are the slow scaffolding of culture. Once scaffolded, they hold the weight of meaning. There are survivors who never speak of what they saw. They carry the names of the eaten in the quiet of a throat, and they sometimes catch themselves answering wafers of charity with a reflexive nod they do not recognize. At night, they dream of the soft, precise clicking noises the nests made. Sounds that, after too many hours awake, begin to sound less like a threat and more like a clock. They wake with the sense that something in the universe is counting, and that their lives have become, somehow, entries on a ledger that cannot be balanced. If there is finally a last taste in the mouth of the story, it is an unresolvable question. What is compassion when it can be weaponized? What is mercy when it can serve as the invitation to devour? Those difficulties do not have clear solutions, and the truth resists the tidy closure that stories love. Instead, the story leaves a residue, a grammar of unease that attaches itself, and so the universe goes on, full of people who will fire engines and mend pipes and sing new hymns and make small mercies for neighbors, unaware that in the pattern of their help, there might be a language some other thing can read. Out beyond the burned horizon, the hive's arc kept moving, seeking fresh ground primed by human hands, shaped by habit and need. In that broad movement, there was no malice as humans name it, only an efficiency that ate and then read the score. Listen, then, for the softest sound left at the edge of the world, not the shriek of void-born ships, nor the clatter of falling pylons, but the small, patient syllable that a child hums without knowing its origin, the notch on a rivet passed from hand to hand like a coin, the rhythm in a machinist's cadence that has learned a new pause. Those are the things that persist. Close your eyes if you must. Breathe in slowly, as if you were settling again into a room that used to be safe. Know this: the settlement is gone, consumed and remade into something other, but noises travel on light and trade and habit. The family's syllable is small and therefore portable. In the dark reaches between worlds, cooks hum, watchmen count, children learn verses, little acts that are ordinary and irreducible. They are the vectors by which a lullaby becomes a beacon. Hold to this last image. Somewhere, on a dim planet that thinks itself ordinary, a child will tiptoe to the window at night and watch the sky and not be able to name why a certain star makes their breath hitch. Somewhere, a foreman will find a notched rivet and keep it with his tools because it is useful to remember where one learned hands. Somewhere, a trader will whistle a strange tune picked up in a tavern, and a traveler will smile. The song will travel. It will not roar. It will whisper. They are still watching. Even in the dark, they're waiting,